All right, so you just got that promotion as sales manager. Huge congrats. But now you're probably thinking, how do I make sure my team is doing well? How can I track all their progress? And of course, hitting all those targets. You've probably heard all the talk about OKRs, objectives, and key results, right? Big tech companies like Google and Salesforce, they seem to love them. But are they really the key to success? Are they going to be the thing that gets your sales team to crush it? Or are they just another one of those management fads, the kind that ends up with you drowning in spreadsheets? That's exactly what we're diving into today. We've got a whole bunch of articles, case studies, even some critical analyses, and we're looking specifically at OKRs for sales teams just like yours.
It's interesting. OKRs are really popular right now, but they've actually been around for ages. They were developed way back in the 70s at Intel by Andy Grove. His whole idea was to create a system where everyone's work was connected to the company's main goal, making it super clear what needed to get done and how to measure success.
That actually reminds me of how my team currently tracks progress. And honestly, it feels kind of all over the place. Could OKRs help us be a bit more focused?
Oh, for sure. Let's say you're working at a company like Salesforce, a B2B SaaS company, and you're trying to really break into the Fortune 500 market. Your company's objective might be something like become the top CRM solution for big enterprises. But to make that happen, your sales team needs to turn that big goal into actionable OKRs.
Okay, so I'm the sales manager. How do I actually break down that company objective into something my team can measure, into key results?
You've got to define really specific outcomes, ones that can be measured, and that actually contribute to that big objective. So for example, one key result could be do 60 product demos for Fortune 500 companies this quarter. That's focusing on your top of funnel line. Then to focus on actually closing deals. Another key result could be sign 15 new contracts with Fortune 500 and to keep those existing clients happy. A third key result could be increase the average deal size for our current Fortune 500 customers, let's say by 25%. All of those key results are directly related to growing within that Fortune 500 market.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely see how that's a lot clearer than what we're doing now. But I've also read that there are some best practices or tips to make OKRs really work well. What have you found?
One thing that comes up a lot is setting those ambitious but achievable targets. Remember Intel's 70% success benchmark. It's not about setting the bar low, it's about pushing for excellence, but also knowing that those really ambitious goals might mean you don't hit 100% all the time.
That's an interesting idea. But I wonder, could that kind of benchmark make some people on the team less likely to really go for that 100%?
That's a good point. And that's where the company culture comes in. It's all about celebrating the effort and the progress. Even when you don't quite reach the target, your team needs to understand that 70%. Doesn't mean being okay with being average. It's about acknowledging how ambitious those are.
That makes sense. So it's not just about hitting those numbers. It's about recognizing how hard everyone is working and encouraging them to keep getting better. Are there any examples of companies that are doing this really well?
Definitely. Google's got a really interesting approach. They let employees actually define their own individual OKRs. But here's the thing. Those individual goals have to be connected to their team's objective, which are then connected to the company-wide goals. So everyone feels like they're contributing to the bigger picture.
So it's less about someone telling you what to do and more about working together, where everyone feels invested in making those OKRs work.
Exactly. And another good example is Adobe. Their managers have these weekly check-ins with their team, specifically to talk about OKR progress. They talk about any problem and make sure everyone is on the same page. Those regular check-ins keep things really transparent and help spot issues early on.
Okay, so we've got clear objectives, measurable key results, we're communicating regularly, and the culture encourages both ambition and flexibility. What else is really important for making OKRs work?
Being able to adapt huge. You know markets change, unexpected stuff happens. Being able to adjust those OKRs when you need to. That's super important. Look at Spotify. They let their teams actually change their OKRs in a quarter if things change. They get that being flexible is how you stay agile and respond to all those changes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Trying to stick to rigid goals when everything's changing, it'd be like trying to steer a speedboat in a hurricane with a rudder that's stuck. But wouldn't letting people make adjustments in the middle of the quarter, wouldn't that make it easy for them to just lower the bar, to make these easier on themselves?
That's definitely a concern. And that's why being open and communicating clearly is so important when you're making those adjustments. Spotify, for instance, they have a whole process for modifying OKRs. So the decisions are based on data and they fit with the company's overall strategy.
So you're still keeping that connection to the big picture, even when you're being flexible.
Exactly. And we can't forget about celebrating those wins. When your team hits a milestone, big or small, you gotta recognize it. It helps keep everyone motivated. Atlassian is a great example. They regularly celebrate OKR achievement during their team meeting. It creates a really positive and encouraging environment.
I'm starting to get how this all works together. It's not just about setting targets, it's about building a whole culture, one that embraces ambition and flexibility and open communication.
Yeah.
And recognizing everyone's hard work. But before we get too carried away with all this OKR enthusiasm, I have a feeling there's another side to this story.
You're right. Well, OKRs sound amazing in theory, and they've definitely worked for some companies. There are some valid criticisms too, especially when you're thinking about using them for sales teams. And we'll dive into those right after this.
Okay, so you mentioned there's another side to this whole OKR thing. What are some of the downsides, the things we need to watch out for?
Well, the structure of OKRs, it can be really appealing, but that same structure can also be what makes them fall apart, especially in sales, where things are always changing. One of the biggest criticisms is just how much time it takes to set up and manage OKRs. You've got to define the objectives, then translate those into goals for each team, then set those key results that you can actually measure, and then you've got to keep track of everything. It just adds another layer of complexity on top of everything else you're already doing.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about some of our reps. They're already swamped. Between juggling deals and all their meetings, giving them more administrative tasks, that could be tough.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. And it's not just the sales team's time either. You need buy-in from management too. They have to be on board, involved in setting those objectives, tracking them, reviewing them. OKRs need everyone to be invested.
So you can't just roll it out and expect everything to magically change. It takes real commitment.
Exactly. And that brings up another criticism. There's not a lot of solid evidence to back up all the hype around OKRs. There are tons of stories and case everyone praising OKRs, but there's not much actual scientific research. Proof they really work, we're kind of relying on what managers say instead of hard data.
Yeah, relying on stories alone doesn't seem very data-driven, does it? Especially when we're asking our team to embrace this whole new system. Makes me wonder, are those success stories telling the whole story?
That's a good point. We can't just get caught up in all the excitement without looking at everything. There's a chance we could set unrealistic OKRs aren't some magic solution. They're complicated, and they need careful planning to make them work.
Okay, so the time commitment and the lack of hard evidence, those are two potential red flags. What else should we be wary of?
Well, the processes and reporting tools, they can get pretty complicated, some of that OKR software, and the methodologies they use can be really intricate. For teams that are used to just having clear goals, this level of detail can be overwhelming.
It sounds like you'd need a degree in data analysis just to manage the OKR system. Is there a chance we could get bogged down in all the details and forget about actually selling?
Oh, definitely. You could end up with what they call analysis paralysis, where you're spending more time tracking and measuring than actually talking to customers and closing deals.
Yeah, that'd defeat the whole purpose, wouldn't it? We want to empower our team, not bury them in spreadsheets.
Exactly. And that leads to another criticism. OKRs might not actually line up with how sales cycles work. Sales can be unpredictable, right? Deals take longer than you expect. Sometimes those rigid quarterly targets, they just don't reflect what's actually happening.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah, you got it. Imagine one of your reps is working on a huge deal, super important for the company, but it's going to take longer than a quarter to close. If they're feeling the pressure to hit that quarterly OKR, the one that's just focused on how many deals they close, they might go for smaller, quicker deals instead and miss out on that bigger opportunity. It could make them focus too much on the short term and actually hurt those customer relationships.
So OKRs could actually encourage the wrong kind of behavior if they don't fit with our sales process.
That's a really important point. And another challenge is just figuring out what those key results should for sales teams. It's tough to find the right balance between measuring things like how many calls they make or how many demos they give versus actual outcomes like closing deals.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance.
Yeah.
We want to track real progress, but we don't want to micromanage or reward people for just being busy. How do you find that sweet spot?
That's something every sales manager has to figure out. If you focus too much on activity metrics, you might end up with a team that's just checking box instead of focusing on results. But if you only look at outcome, you might miss valuable information about what's actually driving those outcomes.
Right, so we need to measure the right things and use that information to help our team.
Exactly. And this brings up another concern. OKRs could lead to a lot of micromanagement. If you're always looking over your team's shoulder, scrutinizing every little thing, you're not giving them the freedom they need to do their best. Trust and empowerment are huge in sales.
Yeah, being watched all the time. That could be really demotivating.
Absolutely. And this ties into another criticism. How rigid OKRs. We talked about being flexible, but actually achieving that flexibility within the OKRs, it can be tricky, especially in sales, where things are always changing.
Right. You might set some big goals at the beginning of the quarter, and then suddenly everything changes. Maybe a competitor comes out with a game-changing product, or there's some big industry shift, and our whole plan goes out the window.
And that's where that rigidity can become a problem. If you're stuck with those original targets, it's hard to adapt and respond to those changes. You might find yourself chasing goals that don't matter anymore, or missing out on new opportunities because you're so focused on hitting those old targets.
So we need to figure out how to adapt those OKRs without losing sight of the big picture.
Exactly. Exactly. And one last thing. There's the worry that OKRs can sometimes lead to. Too much emphasis on quantity over quality. It's easy to get fixated on the numbers, how many calls, how many demos, how many deals, and forget about the bigger goal, building those strong customer relations, creating value in the long term.
So it's not just about getting those deals signed. It's about building trust, really understanding what our customers need.
Exactly. Those numbers are important, but we can't let them overshadow everything else. All those things that make you successful in the long run.
Wow, this is a lot to think about. It sounds like OKRs are a bit of a double-edged sword.
I think that's a great way to put it. They have the potential to be amazing, but there are also a lot of potential problems if you don't implement them carefully.
Right, it's definitely more complicated than I first thought.
It is. The best approach really depends on your team, your company culture, your sales goals, and how much time and effort you're willing to put into making them work.
So for someone who's just been promoted and is facing all of this, how do they decide whether or not to use OKRs?
It all starts with taking a good look at your team and where you are right now. It's really about honestly looking at your team's dynamic. How comfortable are they with using data to track performance? Are they the kind of people who are motivated by clear metrics, specific targets? Or do they work better when they have more autonomy with goals that are more flexible?
Our team's kind of a mix. We've got some people who are all about the data and others who go more with their gut. It seems like finding a system that works for everyone would be pretty gut.
That's why it's so important to really understand everyone's strength and how they like to work. You might even find that a hybrid approach works best, where you use OKRs for some things, but not for others.
That's interesting. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing? What else should we be thinking about?
Your sales cycles are a big one. If your deals are usually pretty complex and take months to close, trying to fit everything into those quarterly OKRs might not be the best idea. It could actually create the wrong incentive. You might need a system that's more flexible, one that can handle those longer timelines.
Right, trying to force everything into that quarterly box probably wouldn't work out too well.
And you also need to think about how much autonomy you want to give your team. If you like to be really hands-on, involved in all the details, OKRs can give you that granular level of control. But if you trust your team to manage their own stuff and make their own decisions, then a system that's less structured might be better.
It's all about finding that sweet spot, isn't it? Between having control and empowering your team, giving them guidance and support without stifling their creativity.
Exactly. And the biggest thing to remember, are you willing to put in the time, the effort it takes to actually make OKRs work? Because it is work. It's not something you can just set up and forget about. It takes constant attention, communication, and you have to be willing to make changes along the way.
It sounds like a pretty big commitment. And if we're not ready for that, maybe we should be looking at other options.
I think that's a really smart approach. Don't feel like you have to use OKRs because everyone else is doing it. Really think about whether it's a good fit for your team, for your company culture, and for you as a manager.
So after all of this, what's the final word on OKRs? Are they the secret to sales success? Or are they just another management fad?
They're not really either one. OKRs are a tool, and like any tool, they can be used well or they can be used poorly. The key is understanding how that tool works, knowing what it's good for and what it's not so good for, and then making a decision based on your specific situation.
So instead of just jumping on the OKR bandwagon, we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, what does success actually look like for my team?
Exactly. Maybe OKRs are the way to get there. Maybe they're not. The important thing is to really think about it and choose the approach that works best for you.
Well said. So for all you new sales managers out there, before you jump headfirst into OKRs, take some time to reflect. Think about your team's strength, the types of sales cycles you have, and your own management style. Maybe OKRs are the key to crushing it, or maybe there's a different approach that's better for you. Whatever you choose, we're here to support you.
And remember, this deep dive has only scratched the surface. There are so many other performance management frameworks out there, and we'll be exploring those in our next episode, so be sure to tune in for that.
That's all for this week's deep dive. We'll see you next time.